Hi, and welcome to episode 3 of the James Talks podcast. Yeah, it's been a little while since I did my last one, where I talked about the phenomenon that is Harry Potter. And obviously, a lot of people who will be familiar with my voice will be primarily because of me reading Harry Potter books over on my Harry World channel, the Home of Potter channel previously before that. Yeah, and also Dob31 Entertainment, where I do a lot of children's stories over there as well. So that's where a lot of people will have heard my voice. And so I thought, because there was that Harry Potter link, that one of my first videos should be all about Harry Potter. But Harry Potter, as I was talking about when I was doing that podcast, it became very clear that, it was the movies that really got me into Harry Potter, not the books. And obviously I'm loving reading the books, but as I confessed last time, just reading the books for the first time, along with you guys, really. So these recordings that I'm putting out, these audio books, which I'm putting out of the Harry Potter books, is effectively the first time I'm properly reading them and seeing the differences between the books and the films. But I am a massive, massive film fan, have been for a very long time. Used to watch them a lot, not as much these days. Used to be a regular cinema goer, again, not quite so much these days. But I thought for this episode, what I would do is talk about my love of films, and generally that's one of the things that's going to kind of crop up in these podcasts, is just me talking about things that I really love. Hopefully there's stuff that it's stuff that you enjoy or that you're interested in as well. And if it's not, then maybe you'll just enjoy the journey as I talk about my journey through films, really. Films that have had a lasting impression on me, films which have been important to my kind of like journey through the movies and so on. So we'll go back in time to start off with. So right back to the 1980s. Now, again, I think I confessed in the last one, this really dates me. But I grew up in a time, and for those people who are my younger listeners, some of this, what I'm about to say, will seem incredibly strange, but I grew up in a time pre-internet. So this was a time where the internet did not exist. So therefore, we could not stream videos or films or whatever. For example, the likes of Netflix and Amazon and YouTube and Disney Plus and so on, all relatively new, but none of them existed at this time. And also, this was actually pre-DVDs, but it did have some magic about it. And that magic was effectively the video store. The place where you could go and there would be wall-to-wall video VHS cassettes and so on. It was one of those weird situations. You look back on these things now and you think to yourself, wow, did that really happen? But you used to walk in and you might have an idea about what film you actually wanted to get. So you'd go and try and find that film. So there would be thousands, potentially thousands, and quite often they were split into different genres. Not always, but sometimes there was like a top 20 or something like that, and they were the most popular ones that were being rented out by people. Sometimes there was like a science fiction area and a comedy, rom-com area and an action, adventure, foreign language. So, and sometimes you went into these places and it was just completely random and you just had to try and search around. So sometimes you went along to the video store with an idea about what you wanted to get. And other times you would go along and you would actually just think, right, you know what, I'm going to go and rent out a video and I'm going to see what takes my fancy. While I'm there, I'm just going to kind of make it up as I go along and kind of see what I end up with, really. See what kind of the front cover, what really takes my fancy. Maybe read the blurb on the back and stuff like that. So it was a bit like going along to a library and hoping you come away with something interesting. So the video stores, they were very popular in the 1980s because they were your source of going to get these movies. We lived in a time with 3 channels in the UK. Okay, so for those people in America who I know follow my Harry World channel, I'm sure you had in the 1980s. I'm sure you had a lot more channels than 3. But we had 3, and then 4. Channel 4 came along. So we had BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, and Channel 4, and that was it. There was nothing else. And video recorders came around. They literally, we were one of the first people I remember amongst my friends and family to actually get a video recorder. I remember when we got it, and it was enormous. It was absolutely enormous. It was, it was a big, bulky piece of equipment. And so yeah, like that was the start of getting videos, and obviously bringing those movies that up until that point had been pretty much, well, they were either at the cinema, so you'd be able to go and see them at the cinema, and again, I'll talk about that in a second, but or you'd have to, for example, just wait until they came out on TV. They just happened to be on television, and you'd have to watch them. Otherwise, you didn't have any access to it. So videos was a real game changer. Also, these days, for example, relatively recently, the last film I went to see at the cinema was Spider-Man No Way Home. And it's already available on Sky Store. So you can go into Sky Store, you can actually download it. You do have to pay for it at the moment because it's relatively new, but it's available. I've just been to my local supermarket, and there are Blu-rays, DVDs. They are all there, ready for you to be able to go and buy. Not many people, I don't think as many people even buy DVDs anymore. But yeah, they're all available, ready to buy. And it was only at the cinema about a couple of months ago. In fact, it might even still be there. This was a time in the 1980s where you had to wait a very long time. If you missed something at the cinema, if you didn't get to the cinema and see that film, it could be years before it was available on VHS, on video. It could actually be years until it was actually released for you to be able to just rent and bring back into your own home. And to be on television, sometimes they'd be like the network exclusive. It would be like, oh wow, this is the first time on national television, and this is a film that would have been potentially at the cinema about 4 years previously. That's what we were dealing with, and that's not an exaggeration. It really was very different. So this leads me to both of these things, talking about the video store and obviously things that I'd been waiting years to be able to see and stuff, brings me to my first love of cinema, and that was Star Wars. Now, Star Wars, again, going into, giving my age away and so on and things like this, but, these podcasts are quite a bit about me, so I'm not ashamed of saying I was born in 1975. You can do the maths if you want to work out how old I am right now. Getting on a bit. Don't feel that. I still in my heart feel like I'm some young teenager or 20-year-old or whatever. But I'm not a million miles away from 50, and that revelation, that realization is just something that seems so bizarre to me. But anyway, that's for another time. So yeah, Star Wars was released in the cinemas in 1977. And I was only 2 years old at that point. So did I go to see it at the cinema? No, I didn't. Star Wars was something that kind of, I wouldn't say passed me by, but it was something that, I wasn't really aware of its general release at the time at all, until obviously it became an absolute phenomenon. And of course, with that came all the toys as well. So I started, I can't actually pinpoint the exact first time I watched Star Wars, but I do remember that the first time I watched it was on VHS, that I actually rented it and I took it home, and that was that. I literally was obsessed with it. It was unlike anything. I mean, the science fiction was quite big at the time. There were some TV shows which were out at the time. So things like Space 1999, oh, what a classic. Star Trek, obviously. So yeah, there were things out there, but Star Wars was on a completely, I think Buck Rogers was another one that springs to mind. Some of these were quite old as well. I think, Space 1999, was certainly made in the 70s. The soundtrack suggested that it was definitely made in the 70s. Buck Rogers may have even been 60s, I'm not sure, 60s, 70s. And of course, the original Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry's vision of Star Trek first came around in the 60s as well. So a lot of these things that we were watching in the 80s were not new. They were just being re-released and so on, or just being played repeats, but we didn't realize they were repeats. Good old repeats. Do you remember that? Oh, it's a repeat. Oh, nowadays you can watch the same thing, kind of on a daily basis on some channels. But yeah, it was a different world. So anyway, Star Wars. And then this pattern emerged where I would go to the video store. My mum, bless her, would take me along to the video store, and we'd be like, what film do you want to get out this time, James? What would you like to get? Star Wars. Really? Again? Because we got Star Wars last time, so are you sure you wouldn't like to get something else? No, Star Wars. So I would get Star Wars. The same, as I said, thousands of films. Not all of them suitable for children, obviously, and I was, I don't know, probably about 8, 9 years old. But yeah, Star Wars was what I wanted. Star Wars was what I got. I mean, you had to hope that it was there as well, because quite often they would have only about 3 or 4 copies of each film. And if you got there and sometimes they would be out. Like those videos were, those films were not available So you just had to go away again, or try and hope that you got there next time and there was one available. That was the way it worked. You couldn't always guarantee that you were going to get the film that you actually wanted to get. But yeah, if it was there, I got Star Wars. And I got to the stage where I literally, myself and my friend Andrew, who I went to primary school with, we knew Star Wars off by heart. Literally word for word, we literally knew Star Wars off by heart. It was ridiculous, but I absolutely loved it. And of course, I then got into all the toys, had so many of the different figures. My favorite Christmas present of all time was that when my granddad, bless him, got me the Millennium Falcon. And yeah, I mean, I can still remember to this day opening that on Christmas Day. Such a special time, and I absolutely loved it. I was obsessed. Anyway, Empire Strikes Back was released in 1980, and The Empire Strikes Back was this thing again that had passed me by. I was only 5 years old when it was released, but I got into Star Wars after I'd seen Star Wars. But before The Empire Strikes Back was available for me to be able to watch on VHS, The Return of the Jedi came out. That's a sign of how ridiculous this used to be. Return of the Jedi was released in 1983. And so this was one of my very, very first trips to the cinema. At the age of, 1983, I'd have been 9. Yeah, no, 8. 8. Am I doing my maths wrong here? 1983. Yes, I'd have been 8 years old. Okay, so yeah, 8 years old it was released. And then, yeah, I went along to watch Return of the Jedi. Now, having not seen The Empire Strikes Back, so I'd seen Star Wars, A New Hope. I was obsessed with it. And Return of the Jedi, I was so excited to see it. Went along to the cinema. And of course, it starts off... spoilers here, guys. I'm sorry, if you haven't seen Star Wars, I'm sure, it's been out for a while. But yeah, it starts off, Han Solo is in carbonite, frozen in Jabba the Hutt's palace. And I'm like, what? What happened to Han? Why is he in carbonite? What happened here? Then there's this guy who keeps on pulling his kind of bit of his mask down and is revealed to be Lando Calrissian. Who's Lando? Never seen him before in my life. And then we start going on, and then they reveal... Oh, I've got to go, and Luke starts saying stuff like, I've got to go and see Darth Vader because I feel there's still good in my father. Your father? When did that happen? So as you can imagine, going to see Return of the Jedi, having not seen The Empire Strikes Back, there were some interesting revelations. So that whole moment of Darth Vader going, Luke, I am your father. When I saw that, yeah, I knew that. I knew that he was your father because I'd had that gradually revealed to me. In The Return of the Jedi. I remember when Obi-Wan Kenobi kind of started to hint that, and Luke guesses that Leia is his sister, and I was like, was that in The Empire Strikes Back? Turns out it wasn't. But at the time I was, so I became obsessed with watching The Empire Strikes Back. I was like, there was this missing part of the story, which I hadn't seen. I started to, imagine what it was like, what had happened and so on, imagining what Cloud City actually looked like, what had happened to Han, I'd heard so many rumors about the battle on Hoth, but hadn't seen any of it, because again, these things weren't available for you to just go and say, I want to watch a clip on YouTube. So yeah, The Empire Strikes Back was this myth to me, this thing that was just, of legend that I hadn't seen. Finally rented a copy of The Empire Strikes Back on VHS, and watched it. Oh my goodness, I can still remember very, very clearly to this day watching The Empire Strikes Back for the first time. Blown away, absolutely blown away. And the thing you would do back then as well, you got to rent them for I can't remember if it was 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever. Maybe it was for 3 days. I'm not sure. You got to rent this VHS copy, and you had to rewind it. So what you would have to do is then press rewind on the VHS player, and it would rewind the tape and so on. So I'd rewind the tape, and you were supposed to do this before you sent it back as well, because obviously this was courteous to the next person, who was going to actually watch the film, to have it at the beginning. Sometimes you would rent a VHS and it would not have been rewound, and before you could actually play it, you had to rewound the tape, and that could take quite a while, and that was such an inconvenience. It really was. Yeah, but I watched The Empire Strikes Back, rewound it, watched it the next morning, rewound it, watched it again. I think by the time I returned it, I'd watched it about 4 times, and I was obsessed. And it was the start of my love for film. Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. Star Wars, I was obsessed with them. I really was. Absolutely loved them. And that was my childhood. Star Wars was really my childhood. That was my thing. And it has remained a big part of my life. I never thought after Return of the Jedi that I would ever see another Star Wars movie. So when The Phantom Menace was released, as you can imagine, as any real Star Wars fan, I was absolutely so excited. I remember queuing kind of like, the day it came out. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to go and see another Star Wars film. This is incredible. And I remember I didn't mind The Phantom Menace, but I do remember coming out thinking, that didn't feel like a Star Wars film. It felt to me like George Lucas had kind of thought, oh, look, all this new stuff I can do with CGI and all these things I can do. He was like a kid in a candy store when it came to all the special effects that he could now do. And the story itself just didn't seem to fit. I mean, this was supposed to be the story of how Anakin Skywalker had eventually turned to the dark side. That was what this trilogy was going to be about. So it was a very fascinating tale that we felt was really important to tell. But, so many, I'm not even going to go into the details of Jar Jar Binks. Misa not going to talk about that. But at the same time, it just didn't feel like a Star Wars movie to me. I remember watching Attack of the Clones and thinking, this felt a bit more Star Warsy, but it still doesn't quite feel that way. They've grown on me a bit, the prequels. I don't mind them as much now. I quite enjoy them. They're part of the Star Wars story. They really are. But yeah, and Revenge of the Sith, I remember watching it again. It was darker and it felt more grown up, which I liked because I was an adult when these were being released. Not that I'm still a big kid at heart, if I'm totally honest. But yeah, it kind of. Yeah, they were okay. And then, of course, more time went by and I didn't think we'd ever see another Star Wars film. And then we got The Force Awakens. Loved The Force Awakens. That was the first time I was like, wow. I walked out and thought, that felt like Star Wars. It really did. That felt much more like the original trilogy that I'd grown up on. Less CGI, more just kind of real life stuff. Great characters. And then, of course, again, spoiler coming up, guys. If you haven't watched The Force Awakens, you might want to stop this now. But my absolute hero, the character that I was, that was my hero growing up with, Han Solo, dies. And I was just, I honestly was like, oh my God, they brought Star Wars back to kill off Han Solo. I mean, Harrison Ford apparently has been stated, he's stated many times that he felt like that he actually wanted Han to die in The Empire Strikes Back. They persuaded him to have Han frozen in carbonite so they could actually see if he wanted to come back for Return of the Jedi. And he decided he wanted to. Or at least received a nice big paycheck in order to do so. But yeah, I was gutted. I really was. And I think it affected the other ones, the Last Jedi and obviously the most recently, The Rise of Skywalker. I think if Han had been involved in all of those, it could have been better. But I did enjoy them. I think The Force Awakens is probably the best out of the three, but I did enjoy all of them. And John Williams' soundtrack being there throughout just makes them. So that is my Star Wars journey. That kind of started it off. We're going to stay right at the very beginning. I'm not going to spend as much time talking about all the other films that I thought about for this podcast. But yeah, I mean, Star Wars was where it all began. So and has been such a big part of my movie journey. I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about that. And as you probably can hear, it's something I'm very passionate about. So yeah, I thought I'd just touch on a few other little films that were really standing out from my childhood. I have always been, as I said just previously, I'm a big kid at heart. I really am. And my favourite day of the year, probably growing up, was Christmas Eve. More so than Christmas Day. I just loved the magic of Christmas Eve. I love the idea of Santa's coming tonight. Oh, everything was so exciting. All that expectation, all the presents under the tree, the stockings ready to go. Christmas hadn't happened yet. I've always had this feeling on Christmas Day of like, oh, it's all just disappearing again. Christmas Day is great fun and you get all your presents and you spend lovely time with family and things like that and you have a lovely meal. But Christmas Day is disappearing. On Christmas Eve, the whole of Christmas is still there. And I used to absolutely love that feeling, that magic. But I always used to kind of watch films on Christmas Eve. Quite often what just happened to be on television at that particular time. And such classics that sprang into my mind when I was thinking about this podcast, where one of our dinosaurs is missing. Now, this is a film, I might have to do a bit of a trip down memory lane with some of these films. When I was making a bit of a list of the films that I might want to talk about that stand out, I haven't watched this film for about 20, 30 years, maybe. I don't know. Maybe I need to again. And sometimes maybe these films will be like, really, really, that had a special soft spot for me because it hasn't stood the test of time. I don't know. But I remember watching One of Our Dinosaurs Is Missing. So, and some of you may never even heard of it, but Peter Ustinov, I think it was. And yeah, it was, it was a very British film. But yeah, I absolutely loved it. And it just happened to be on Christmas Eve one year, and I think that was probably a big part of why it stood out for me. Mary Poppins, absolutely loved it. Mary Poppins was on Christmas Day one year, and it stood out to me. I loved it. Flash Gordon, I still love, and the Queen soundtrack as well. Flash, and then Flash Gordon, Flash. We don't have to. Just such a hero, and I absolutely loved it. I really did. Watched that so many times. Flash Gordon. That was on Christmas Eve one year. Really stood out to me. Santa Claus the movie with Dudley Moore. Again, one of those films that I think feels so Christmassy for the first half, and then the second half where they're in New York, and there's the. I think it's John Lithgow's character comes into play and stuff like that. It tails off. I've always loved the first half, but the second half feels like a completely different movie to me, but has a very special spot. The Indiana Jones trilogy, and I know there's been a fourth. There's rumored to be a fifth, but for me, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Temple of Doom. Temple of Doom was on Christmas Day one year as well, and absolutely loved the trilogy. And The Last Crusade, went to the cinema to see The Last Crusade. And yeah, another Harrison Ford classic, obviously. The Back to the Future films. Back to the Future, I remember watching the first one on VHS, and then I went to see the other two. And they were refilmed. I seem to remember Back to the Future Part 2 and Back to the Future Part 3 were filmed back to back. So they literally came out just 1 year after each other. Went to see both of those at the cinema. But they have really stood the test of time as well. There is no doubt whatsoever that the Back to the Future films have stood the test of time. They are brilliant to this day. I absolutely love them. Michael J. Fox, such a star. And obviously, he's had all his problems with Parkinson's and so on, and it's massively curtailed his career. But it's so good to see, him still going, even if it's not, on screen as much as I'm sure he would have liked to. But yeah, absolutely love the Back to the Future films, and I've watched those so many times, and relatively recently. You can just sit down and watch that trilogy back to back if you really wanted to. Ghostbusters, the original Ghostbusters 2, but it's nothing like the first one. Ghostbusters was an absolute phenomenon. And again, it was one of those films that I took quite a while to see. I didn't see it at the cinema. I had a Ghostbusters jumper, and I remember my Ghostbusters jumper, I think my brother had one as well, and it had Slimer on the front, and he glowed in the dark. And I remember we went on a family day trip to some caves, so you'd be able to go down into the caves and look at all the stalactites and the stalagmites, and everyone was there. And then because it was all dark, they said, "All right, we're going to see." And my Slimer was just glowing on my jumper all the time. But I hadn't seen Ghostbusters at that time. I just wanted to be part of the phenomenon, had to get the merchandise, and so yeah, eventually saw it, absolutely loved it. To this day, again, one of those films which I do think stands at the test of time. I think the fact that Ghostbusters didn't take itself very seriously. There are some scenes in it where, it really is just making fun of itself. And sometimes that's what you need in a film, you really do. And The Ugly Dachshund. Now, The Ugly Dachshund is one of my most embarrassing stories, to share, really. Sometimes I think to myself, shall I mention that? But The Ugly Dachshund, if you haven't seen it, is a Disney classic where there's a man and woman, a husband and wife, and they have these dachshunds, and they adopt what seems to be a little puppy, but it turns out that it's a Great Dane, and it grows up, and obviously it's enormous compared to the other dogs that it's hanging around with, the dachshunds, and it's incredibly clumsy, and they start to get fed up with it. And there's this one scene where the dachshunds kind of wind up the Great Dane, and he ends up kind of completely trashing this pool party and getting into real trouble. And then they're looking like they're going to get rid of him and so on. And I remember being devastated by this. I've always been a huge dog lover. I'm a huge animal lover, but I love dogs. And I just felt so sorry for this dog that was being shouted at. And I remember kind of like thinking practically holding back tears, if not potentially crying, because their Great Dane was going to be got rid of. And yeah, so embarrassing story. I got so emotionally involved in some of these things that were just ridiculous, really. But yeah, that one crept into my mind, and the other one from the 80s, and it kind of getting very near to the end of my trip through the 80s. Gremlins, a bit of a classic. Now, the reason I included Gremlins in my list is because Gremlins I was not allowed to see. Now, if my mum's listening to this podcast, they were quite strict. I mean, my brother is 2 years younger than me, and amazingly got to watch things at 2 years younger than me. So yeah, but Gremlins was what we call in the UK 15 rated. Now, nowadays, something has to be pretty extreme to be 15 rated. Back then, all you had to have was puppets and cuddly toys effectively taking over a village area at Christmas, and that made it 15 rated. You could not watch this film unless you were 15 at the cinema or on VHS. I suppose in America it would be the equivalent of, I don't know, TV 14 or something like that. But oh goodness me, Gremlins must be horrific. Gremlins is not horrific. Gremlins these days would be lucky if it was what we call PG, so it really is not a scary movie. That partly is because, this was a time when pre-CGI, and Gremlins to these days do not look as scary as maybe they did back then. They clearly do not look real. I'm sorry to take away some of the magic, but there we go. So that kind of removes some of the hysteria that went with them. But I wasn't allowed to watch Gremlins. I was not 15, and it was 15 rated. And so it had this mystery to me, this thing of, Gremlins is this big scary movie. Oh, I'm not allowed to watch Gremlins. I can't wait till the day I'm allowed to watch Gremlins. And when I was 15, Gremlins had been out for quite a while, and I rented Gremlins on VHS and I watched it. I can't remember. I think I rented it, or it was on TV. And it wasn't scary at all. And it didn't really affect me in any way. And I did think to myself, I could have watched this a long time ago. I do like Gremlins. I wouldn't say it's one of my favourite films of all time, but it certainly had this place of like, oh my goodness, I'm not allowed to watch this scary film. And everyone else, all my friends have watched it. It must be amazing. It wasn't, but there we go. I didn't mind it. Okay. And then we had the James Bond films. Now, I have always loved the James Bond films. Watched every single one of them, apart from the latest one, which I haven't watched yet. No Time to Die. That is a film which needs to be watched by me very soon. I've heard good reviews about it, which is good to hear. But yeah, James Bond, I grew up with Roger Moore. Roger Moore was the James Bond of the 80s. And then obviously, he was taken over, Timothy Dalton took on the role for a short while before handing it on to Pierce Brosnan, and then on to Daniel Craig. Sean Connery, obviously, George Lazenby for one film. But I absolutely loved James Bond. He had the same name as me for a start, so that was a big appeal. But it was also something that we would watch as a family. There weren't many films that would have that appeal, but this was one of those things. If James Bond was on maybe a bank holiday or a weekend or something like that, they on BBC One or ITV, they would have a James Bond film. Totally might not be the most recent one or whatever, but it would be on, and we as a family would sit down and we would all sit there and watch James Bond. And it was one of the few things that seemed to have an appeal to everyone in the family. And so it became a big deal, a big part of my childhood, a big part of me looking back on these films and so on. At the time, Moonraker was my favourite James Bond film by a long way, partly because they got to go into space. And so this effectively was James Bond meets Star Wars for me. And I was happy as Larry, because you suddenly have people firing laser guns at each other in a James Bond movie. If you haven't watched Moonraker, it takes a very different turn. It starts out like any other James Bond film on Earth, and then suddenly they go up in space shuttles up into this amazing space station and start firing at each other with lasers, and it turns into a complete and utter sci-fi movie. But hey, that was all part of the fun. So yeah. The James Bond movies have always had a special place in my heart as well. Superman 1, Superman 2, and Superman 3. The Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, not quite so much. But But yeah, the first three, and I went to see the third one at the cinema. The second one I watched so many times with General Zog and so on. And the three, that I think they were imprisoned in a shard of glass at one point. That's what it seemed like. And then they escaped and wreaked havoc. And yeah, Christopher Reeve, such a great Superman. Again, a bit of a tragic story in terms of him falling off his horse and being paralyzed from the neck down, eventually dying and so on. So watching him in those movies always has that slight tinge of sadness now. But, I love the Superman movies as well. And it was probably a precursor for how much I was going to love the Marvel films later in my life, really. So then we move on, and again, into kind of the 90s. Now, my taste started to change in the 90s, and I started to really get into action films. Starting with things like Die Hard 2. I haven't watched Die Hard. I watched Die Hard 2 before I watched Die Hard, and then Die Hard 2, absolutely loved. Terminator 2, again, hadn't watched Terminator because Terminator was 18 rated and I wasn't 18, so I wasn't allowed to watch it. Did watch it, and again, not particularly scary by today's standards, I think, anyway. Terminator 2, absolutely loved. Edward Furlong, I think most of boys my age, all the girls seem to be fancying Edward Furlong, and so, obviously he was cool. You needed to watch these things to find out how to be cool. I often failed at being cool, but at least I was trying. So there we go. But yeah, Terminator 2, Die Hard 2, Top Gun. Again, the girls all seem to like Tom Cruise. So, I didn't really have a motorbike and a kind of F-14 jet to fly, but hey, I could at least pretend that I was cool, and obviously, so these kind of movies were how I was starting to kind of think, right, I need to try and be, kind of this sort of like cool dude and so on, which I failed at miserably on a regular basis. Then went off to university, and when I went to uni, I got really into, again, what you would probably call cool movies. Things that you watched because you were told they were the coolest thing ever, and you believed that they were the coolest thing ever, even though when you watch them back, are they? So for example, this was Quentin Tarantino time, where you had Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, both good movies. I think I prefer, having watched them both relatively recently, I think I prefer Pulp Fiction, although it does feel like about 4 or 5 different movies thrown into one. It really does. The cohesion of it is a bit all over the place. Great soundtracks, and those soundtracks, everyone had that soundtrack to Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs on CD in the 90s and so on. When I was at uni, everyone had those. That you had to have the big Reservoir Dogs poster on your wall. I think most people had that. I went to the cinema when I was at university to watch GoldenEye. I think it was the first James Bond film with Pierce Brosnan. And, back then they used to have these huge, great big cardboard cutouts in the foyer area of the cinema, literally the size of a room, kind of like the height of a room, certainly about 7 foot tall, about 5 foot wide. And I remember leaving the cinema, and I do not know why I asked this question, but I went up to the people who were working there and said, "Can I have that?" Now, of course, their answer should have been no, that's ridiculous. Of course, you cannot have the 7 foot by 5 foot cardboard cutout of Pierce Brosnan, which is how we're advertising this particular film in our cinema. They should have said no, but for some bizarre reason, maybe it was the lad's last day there and he couldn't care less and he was just ready to leave and was going to leave on a high. But for some reason, the guy said, yes, you can have it. So I carried, with the help of my mate, this 7 foot by 5 foot cardboard cutout of GoldenEye all the way back to my flat, the place where I was staying as a student, and set it up in my room. It took up most of my room, and I had it there for about at least the next year or two. It was a talking point. It wasn't very practical, and I'm sure the person who gave it to me was not supposed to do so. But no one else had one, so hey, that was cool. But yeah, I was getting into, so I had that. Everyone else had Reservoir Dogs posters on their wall. I had a 7 foot by 5 foot cardboard cutout of GoldenEye from the cinema. But yeah, all part of the fun. Films like, for example, Seven and Leon and Goodfellas and Heat and things like this are, these were the kind of like big shootout films with Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, when Robert De Niro was a serious actor back in those days. These were the films I was into. I loved a good shootout. The shootout in Heat, which still to this day a lot of people see as one of the best shootout scenes, when they come out from the bank, and there's no, I think one of the biggest things about it is there's no soundtrack. It's just literally guns. It's just literally kind of bullets flying. But I remember watching that in the cinema, Heat, and thinking, this is amazing. And it just went on and on and on. That shootout scene went on for about, I don't know, about at least 10, 15, 20 minutes. That's how I remember it. Just literally just one. It was just all action. Just incredible. Brilliant film, really, really is. Heat, again, another one of those films I think has definitely stood the test of time. Probably, potentially, one of Al Pacino and Robert De Niro's finest moments. And yes, I know they were in The Godfather, which you'll notice has not really been mentioned. These iconic movies. I'm just going through what made my journey. The Godfather movies have never been on my agenda. I think I've watched one of them. Some people might be listening to this. What? How can you not have watched the Godfather movies? It just hasn't appealed to me. Hasn't really massively appealed to me. Goodfellas, obviously has that kind of mafia side to it, and love that. But yeah, maybe it's something I need to. I don't know, but other movies I watched for the first time towards my latter years at university, which I still love to this day. Swingers, one of the first outings of Vince Vaughn and Jon Favreau, who obviously pretty much was responsible for, wrote the original Iron Man film, with Robert Downey Jr., the first in the Marvel franchise. Jon Favreau stars in that, and I think pretty much wrote it as well. He went on. His latest things are all to do with Disney Plus. He's been very responsible for The Mandalorian and the new Boba Fett series and things like that. So another guy after my own heart, keeping the Star Wars franchise going. Swingers, just about two guys. The thing I love about Swingers is it just feels like a night out. You can watch Swingers and it's just they go from bar to bar, and that's all it is really. It's just a bunch of guys just having a night out and then having another night out, and it was so relatable, and it just, you can sit there with a few beers and just watch it and you feel like you've had a night out with some mates. And it drops in a bit of Vegas as well. I went to Las Vegas for the first time in 2000, the year 2000. And then I went back there with my now wife when we were engaged in 2001 for our first big holiday. We had 2 weeks there, took in the Grand Canyon and so on as well. Went back to Vegas in 2006, went back to Vegas with the kids when Josh, my son, was 2 years old, which seems mental, but there we go. We went to Vegas in 2013, and then we went there in 2019 to Vegas. This time we took my mum. And 2019, she was in her 70s, but she had a great time as well. And for me, I love Vegas. Maybe it is one of those places you either love or you hate, but I love Vegas. And Swingers, has that kind of, as I say, that night out feel, and they go to Vegas and so on. And it's where the line of kind of Vegas, baby, which has been repeated in so many other films, stood out from. Not long after that, went to the cinema and watched Ocean's 11. That was Vegas personified for me. I absolutely love. I've watched Ocean's 11 so many times. Ocean's 12 was all right, but it didn't have Vegas in. Ocean's 13, they went back to Vegas, but it still wasn't as good as the original. Ocean's 11 is such a good movie. George Clooney, Brad Pitt on form, Matt Damon. Such a great film. Absolutely love it. So Ocean's 11, following on my Vegas theme. Dazed and Confused. If you haven't watched Dazed and Confused is about a bunch of high school kids in the 70s finishing school, kind of like having their last day at school. Some of them had their last day ever. Early performances from the likes of Matthew McConaughey and so on, playing a guy who literally kind of like is about 25, looks about 40, and hanging around school kids. It's a bit dodgy really, but there we go. Great movie, amazing soundtrack, and again, it just feels like a night out. It just feels like it's just, them going around from bar to bar, getting ready for a night out, going to a party in the woods. It's just such a good chill out movie. It really is. But it was also about this time I started to. I've always been a bit of an old romantic, and so yeah, it was about this time I started to get into rom-coms. Had a split up. I broke up with someone and watched High Fidelity, and it just literally High Fidelity is literally just about a whole load of breakups. Just literally just a guy who kind of has breakup. Matthew Broderick, and it's just like no, is it? No, it's not Matthew Broderick. I'm trying to remember who. Oh dear. Maybe someone can put in the comments who the star in High Fidelity is. I should have looked at that, but yeah, just it's just again it related to me at the time. But yeah, things like Before Sunrise with Ethan Hawke, great film. And then obviously they've done a couple more before Sunset Before Midnight, I think they are. But fantastic movie. Again, just feels like a night out around Vienna, I think it is. Really different, just really simple. But yeah, just feels like a night out. Just, I really love, great film. But yeah, the one that really kind of like the next biggie really came along in 1997 when I went to see Titanic. Now, I am a bit of a historian. I love history, always have loved history. I have a degree in history. It's one of my things that so that side of it was really appealing to me. You throw in history with an amazing love story between Jack and Rose, spectacular, special effects. I remember watching that at the cinema, and literally I couldn't believe what I was watching. It looked so real. It felt like you were literally standing back and watching what actually happened to the Titanic at the time. James Cameron, excelled himself as far as I'm concerned. Some people will, say, oh, it was, they kind of had things where they took liberties with the truth and the past and so on. Maybe they did, but what an amazing film. I love Titanic. I loved it so much. I went to the cinema 5 times with 5 different people. I dragged different people along. I said, you've got to come and see this film, mainly because I just wanted an excuse to go and watch it again and didn't really want to go and sit there on my own. But I loved Titanic. I still love Titanic. I have watched Titanic so many times. Potentially it is the film I've watched more times the only films potentially I've watched more times than Titanic are the original Star Wars trilogy. I absolutely love it. And it's 3 hours long, but it just every single time. And ridiculously, every single time you kind of just hope Jack might survive. But hey, I absolutely loved it. So yeah, that one, really stands out for me as being one of my favorite films of all time and still is to this day. Probably would make my top 5. But there we go. Maybe I'll see if I can list my top 5. Then, of course, I went into a phase of kind of really enjoying wacky comedies. The ones that stand out to me, again, Vegas themed, The Hangover. The Hangover, I loved The Hangover. And it had been another film that had been out for a little while before that, Anchorman. I remember being in hysterics watching Anchorman for the first time. Absolutely loved it. American Pie and American Pie 2. Watched American Pie 2 in Vegas. First time I watched it. One of my few American cinematic experiences. Watching a movie in America is very different to watching a movie in the UK. People go into a cinema in the UK and they sit there in stone silence, or at least I hope they do, because I don't want to be interrupted. I want to listen to every single word. In America, people cheer, they laugh, they chant, and it is a really enjoyable experience, but it does take some getting used to when you've got used to sitting in a quiet. Mind you, I'd much rather have people chanting and shouting and cheering and being involved in the film than people, as you get sometimes in the UK, coming in and just sitting there and having a chat and not even watching the movie. One of my absolute pet hates. I thought I'd also mention a few Christmas movies, which have become a bit of a tradition, but for my wife and I, and now with our kids as well. So, Love Actually, The Holiday. My wife and I watched that. I wouldn't even say The Holiday is a massively great movie, but it seems to have resonated with my wife and I, and we watch it every year now. Quite often we try to squeeze it in. It's become a bit of a Christmas Eve kind of movie type thing as well. It's becoming harder because we used to be like after the kids had gone to bed and Santa was on his way, so the kids had to go to bed early. Now my kids are 11 and 14, and they let's just say they know And I won't say any more than that. But so yeah, getting them to bed on Christmas Eve is a lot harder now. So starting a movie at 10 o'clock is not going to work because we're going to be up early the next morning anyway. So yeah, but it has become a bit of a Christmas tradition. And Elf. Again, going back to Anchorman, Will Ferrell, kind of like, you can't go wrong. Elf, such a great film. Always makes me laugh, however many times I've seen it. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And then, of course, as I said, I've just mentioned about my children, I am a massive, massive Disney fan. So Disney, I think they know how to do things. But yeah, some of the ones that really stand out to me, The Lion King, absolutely love The Lion King. And then I remember taking my two children along to watch Frozen. Now, watched Frozen for the first time, and I remember being blown away by it. I remember when Let It Go first came on, and I thought, this is like going to watch a musical. This is not just like watching a Disney film at the cinema. And I remember walking out thinking, I potentially enjoyed that more than my children. But hey, as I said at the beginning, I am a big kid at heart. I really am. Love Frozen. I think I even preferred Frozen 2. I thought there were some great songs in there. I think it was because I went in with slightly low expectations, thinking there's no way they'll surpass the first one. And for me, they did. I thought it was a really good story, some great songs, and yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. So Frozen, I had to drop it in there and give it a mention. I'm going to finish soon, so if you've got a bit bored of me waffling on about all these different movies, don't worry, I am not far away from the end. But I've got two franchises to finish on, okay? And they are two franchises which are the only two franchises that have come close to Star Wars for me, and one has potentially surpassed it now. So first of all, and I'm not going to dwell on this one for too long because this was the focus of my last podcast, Harry Potter. Okay, so Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, The Chamber of Secrets, Prisoner of Azkaban, The Goblet of Fire, The Order of the Phoenix, The Half-Blood Prince, The Deathly Hallows Part 1 and Deathly Hallows Part 2. Now, unlike Star Wars, I watched all 8 of these movies at the cinema. I absolutely loved them. I loved the magic of it. I loved, and I know obviously the magic, it's a bit of a pun because obviously they're wizards and, etc., etc., but I loved the magic of it. These films are incredible. The stories, the characters. And I think that, having read the books and so on, I really do feel that although there are extra bits in the books, I feel like the films do them justice. They really do. Some of them, they maybe even enhance the performances of the actors. It's just, honestly, these Harry Potter films will stand the test of time. People will be watching these in 20 years from now. There's no doubt about it whatsoever. And I would not be at all surprised to see what happened with Star Wars happen where, 20 years on, whether J.K. Rowling is still around or whatever, but someone will probably make another Harry Potter movie. Will make another Hogwarts-based movie anyway, put it that way. That whether it will be based on a film that a book that J.K. Rowling has written, or whether they've just kind of bought the rights to it and have created something, because obviously George Lucas, he created Star Wars, but George Lucas did not create the most recent ones at all. He was very much responsible for the prequels, but he effectively handed over Star Wars to Disney. That Disney effectively owns Star Wars now. George Lucas created this world. J.K. Rowling, the same might happen if she certainly doesn't need the money, but it's possible that in the future we will see more Harry Potter movies. That would not totally surprise me. There is an appetite for it, that's for sure. And then the one I've saved for last, which, I touched on briefly, is the Marvel series. Starting with Iron Man, going all the way through to Avengers Endgame. And obviously it has continued afterwards. We've had a couple of Spider-Man films. We've got series that are coming out like WandaVision and Hawkeye and Winter Soldier and Falcon, Loki. There are so many, brilliant. We've got a new one coming out now, which is Doctor Strange 2 as well. The Marvel universe is continuing as I speak. But for me, those films from the first Iron Man, from when at the very end of Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr. says the words, "I am Iron Man," to the end of Endgame when he says his last words of "I am Iron Man." It's so perfect. It's to make almost like 20 odd movies, and every single one of them stand up and be a film that's worth watching, in my opinion. Some of them are better than others, but every single one of them is fantastic, in my humble opinion. And Avengers Endgame, when you get to the culmination of something that huge, there is always a danger that it will be let down. I mean, I was a massive Game of Thrones fan. And for me, the final series of Game of Thrones just felt like a bit of a rush. It felt like such a shame in many ways. It felt like another series was required. It felt like, that we'd got this far and it had been such an amazing journey. And then it just felt like it was a rushed kind of like throwaway ending to me. Everything just all happened in such a short space of time. And so you worry when you go into the culmination of this huge, like 10 years almost of build-up. And you worry that it's not going to actually do it justice, that it's going to be an anticlimax, but it was the complete opposite. Avengers Endgame was immaculate and was the first film to overtake The Empire Strikes Back as my favourite film of all time. Avengers Endgame, for me, is the best film I've ever watched. I remember when I come out of a cinema, and during that, I think it was almost like 3 hours long, but during that time, when I've laughed, I've cried, I've sat there with goosebumps, for kind of like almost an hour when I'm watching things, and I'm just literally, almost saying to myself and having to almost say it out loud, oh my God, I cannot believe what is happening here. Getting so emotionally involved, so engrossed, loving the characters. It had everything for me. And so these Marvel films, I during the first lockdown of the pandemic, I decided to start right back at the beginning. And then I just watched Avengers Endgame the year before, and I decided, right, okay, a lot of time on my hands. So yeah, I'm a teacher who was not in school. Doing supply, I was furloughed, and so therefore I had a lot of time on my hands. And so I watched them, and it was such a journey. It was such an experience, and I'll have to do it again at some point. But it was what films are all about for me. So this is my finishing point, really, of today's podcast. This journey that you can go on with movies, they are huge in terms of escapism. If you're having a bad day, if you're just not happy with what's going on in your own world, go into someone else's. Go into this magical world that we can have on our TV screens, on the big screen at the cinema. And that journey of going from VHS to DVD to Netflix and to Disney Plus and so on, a lot of the technology around it has changed, but one thing has not changed, and that is your emotional response to what you're watching. If you're not emotionally involved in what you're watching, if you don't care about the characters, if you don't care about what's going on, this movie's not for you. But if you find a movie, if you find a film that absolutely engrosses you, that makes you think to yourself, I just want to watch it again the second it finishes, then you found a movie that's going to last with you. It's going to be with you forever. And I hope you found movies along the way that have done that for you in the same way they have for me. Anyway, that long ramble about movies, about films, okay, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this little ramble along through the 80s, the 90s, the noughties, and right up to bang up to date and so on. So hope you've enjoyed it, guys. Feel free to kind of hit a like or subscribe to my channel or to my other channels, Harry World, Dob31 Entertainment, and of course the James Talks podcast. I'll be back soon with another podcast, much sooner than the gap between the last two, I promise. I'm on my Easter holidays. I got time to do this at the moment. Hope you're well, guys, and I will be speaking to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.